involves construction, building, manufacturing furniture, all the improvements of a house. It's a major part of our economy, but that to be going down fast, that makes the term recovery stop being a question of poor judgment and veer over what we call why they're not in an economy that any kind of change. And that all is true before we look at two big factors now, rising energy prices, rising energy prices is a very serious problem. Everything you're wearing, everything you bought for lunch, came to wherever you bought it from by a truck. The truck runs on petrol, petroleum products. That is going to affect the price of everything. Our inflation the last month or two has been jumped, made of the price of everything. Everything depends on energy. What does that mean? It means all of us, whether it's heating oil in our home, gasoline to power our cars, and so on, we're all going to have to spend more money on those things, which is less money we're going to be able to spend on everything else. And where does that money go? Into the hands of a dozen national oil companies somewhere in the world, and the companies that process all that stuff. So the money is being taken from the mass of people who would expect it to actually get the economy going and being funneled into the hands of those who are already rich and are not going to spend that anyway. And economic crisis. And since one of the major ways we have in the United States fertilizer, since a major ingredient of fertilizer, petroleum, plague on us for at least the rest of you want to stock up on these and lives soon. So we're not out of our plagued by a number of issues. Take a fragile economy already and plunge it a disaster. Now, some of you think that President Obama and the Democratic Party won't let that happen. Their election possibility. But as a professional economist all my life, let me assure you that because the people who pay economists want something doesn't mean that the economists can produce it. President Bush had the best economists around, just like Obama does. The worst conceivable thing that could have happened to Mr. Bush in the last year of his presidency was to see the president collapse. Economists could say that part of the election that blew Mr. Obama into office was a win that was so angry about what was left over from the Bush side that was fueled by that crisis here that struck them hard. What got Mr. Obama in was the same anger about the crisis that he suffered or elected last year, which can do the same to the Republicans next year. Because there's a fuel of anger, the very thing that Matt said at the beginning, now tipping the politics of that anger, going after who's ever worried about a problem that doesn't go away. I'm going to come back to that. Let me try briefly, and I apologize for those who have never before, to give you a very quick overview of what this crisis is. This is not up and down. Our system capital is fundamentally unstable. Give you the last big point was in the 1930s. One that everybody looks studies, and that was a real doozy. However, since that was over, and that ended in 11 years, 1929, 1940, when that was over, you might have thought, okay, we'll put that behind us. But between the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of the one we're in now, 2007, there were 11 others, 11 downtowns. Those of you who were around New York in 1970, remember, that was a big one here then. New York City headline bankruptcy and so forth. So this is a system that throws us out of work, plunges us in economic trouble every 2 years, and no president, no political party, no economic party has yet figured out how to stop that. Every president, including this one, has gone on radio, or had television, or television, and said something about his policy. Usually said this. Got these policies in place to get us out of this crisis. And there was a pregnant pause, and he continued, and to make sure we do not have these again in the future. By that standard, every president of the United States is a liar. Hasn't been able to deliver on that promise. Given that President Obama is doing things that others have done, new, there's not much reason to believe that his promise won't happen. Leaving, we're stuck. But this one is very bad because it comes at the end of a 30-year period in American history, which some economists, some of us, have been talking about for a while, but really kind of no one wants to listen. But now, people are beginning to listen about concerns about nuclear power, and we have an economic crisis that makes folks really think again about the last 30 years. Very briefly, first, over the last 30 years, fundamental change that cannot be overstated or exaggerated. Real wage, yeah, power of work to average American worker stop rising. For 150 years before the 1970s, it had kept going up. It's an amazing story. It's what made the United States an unusual place to be. It was part of the reason why so many people came from all over the place to come here, because they had got the idea here, things got better, and they were right. And there was no great history
Can't
about
change
it.
the channel.
Businesses had to
Well,
pay
my
higher
father
wages.
actually
They had to pay more wages, but there was no great
change the
wage.
channel on me and put this
We
on
weren't
and
very
work for a while.
nice.
Take it something.
We killed. That meant they weren't there, and they wouldn't have worked for us anyway. We brought some people here against their will. No.
It's the first time I've seen
But a
somebody
lot
really
of
call it
people
tell the
came
truth about
here
that shit.
for looking for higher wages, which meant give them higher wages. They wouldn't have come here otherwise, and then you would have had no one.
This is how the revolution.
But the problem here in America was not just bringing them this knowledge, and keeping the job once they came here. Because it turns out, away from the Native Americans, there was free land for everybody. We did to work real nice here on the East Coast, but they tend to they would run away and start farming. They didn't know how to do anything. So to get the worker to come, wages rising, people work. Right. So for 150 years, Americans got this weird idea that they lived in a charmed place. God really loved us here, and the wages low. We could have a higher standard of living. We could work hard and get better paid. The rest of the world, people understand you have to work hard. The rest doesn't seem to follow. At least not the way it did here. So Americans got this idea to get better. Every generation was going to live better. Kids, well, decided to have and still better. Try to get with me. But just to imagine for a minute, what would happen to a culture and a population which for 150 years believed what I just said? Was it more or less true? And then it all stopped. You stop. And that's the truth. The real wage in the United States, average amount earned adjusted for the prices of the things you have to buy, is exactly the same now as it was in 1970. No change. Actually, a little less. But basically, Americans were shocked, awed, let's say, traumatized. But because we are a people who are very realistic, we react to this sea change the way a fundamental change that nobody talked about. No president went on TV to talk to us. What does it mean? How do we deal with this? How do we get around this? Come to what? Nothing. So Americans dealt with it as individuals. That meant we tried as a nation to solve a social chain with an individual act. Never. Got a social problem, you need a social solution. What the individual act ends up being is an attempt to escape. It doesn't work real well. Here's how the American people escape. Elsewhere, I go over all the details, but don't have time. Americans escaped in two ways. First, did more work. If the wage per hour doesn't go up, but you want to give the American dream to your children, an education, a nice home, a nice car, a vacation, all the rest, and you can't get it by rising wages the way parents and grandparents did, well, then you do more hours. You get more people in the house to do more hours of work. And starting in the 1970s, that's what we did. Americans did more and more hours. You had a job, you got a second. If you were a teenager, you did something on the weekends and maybe after school. And if you were retired, you rethought your retirement. But the biggest change was adult American women began leaving the house where they had spent a large amount of their time and went into paid employment. Now, some people in America have been doing that a long time, but I'm talking about a huge sea change. Millions and millions of American women moved into the labor force in a massive way. If I had time, I'd talk to you about all the changes that meant in our culture. We all live. Women hold the family life together, the emotional center of most American households. We make women exhausted by working them an extra shift. Famous professor of sociology at Berkeley, a wonderful woman named Arlie Hochschild, wrote a book called The Second Shift. She documents that when the women in America went to work since the 1970s, they didn't do work outside the house because they freed up hours from their homework, housework. They just added it. But you can't physically do that. You're exhausted. You can't hold then the family together. But what happened over the last 30 years since the 1970s? In the 1970s, if you watched the family program on television, it was all sugar and sweetness, nice daddy, nice mommy, two children, a dog, lots of toys, everybody quite happy. Today, you look at a program about a family, and you're presented with a dysfunctional family. The husband is pissed at the wife. The wife doesn't want to go near him. The children are mouthing off all the time. You know the story. We're just looking at the results of an economic shift. America, 5% of the world's population, we consume 65% of the psycho drugs, antidepressants, tranquilizers. What is that about? And by the way, the biggest consumer, adult American women, that might be connected to what has happened to them and to the pressures they're under. May have something to do with a 55% divorce rate. That doesn't count all the people who don't live together anymore but don't go through the legal process of divorce. It traumatized our society. The only thing more bizarre than what we did to ourselves as people by not dealing with this end of rising wages was to see how it became politically useful. The Republicans made the best. They became the champion of family values. They concocted the notion there were the good old days, and we should go back to the good old. We should get rid of everything that upsets the family. Sexy programs on TV, abortion, lots of things. To go back to the family that we have lost. Well, they were tapping into something real, and they made it work. Interesting, because the corporation who made out like bandits because they didn't have to raise wages anymore funded the Republicans to celebrate the family values. That again, the people who were killing the family became the big supporters of the celebration of the lost family. One in this country, they did it. The second thing the American people did is they discovered that sending the women out to work and transforming the household brought in money because the wife and other people were doing more hours, but didn't help because there were a whole new set of expenses. Wife had to have a second car. Wife had to have a whole other set of outfits. The family couldn't cook food for hours. They had to buy the food prepared. And you all know that that costs costs a lot more than making it yourself. When you added it all up, the extra was gone. So they had to do the one thing that's left for a working class. They want to consume more, have a better standard of living, live the American dream, but they can't get any more wages, and they're exhausted. By the way, this little statistic I love to quote. According to the OECD, a major international organization that collects these data, American workers do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class in any advanced country. So if you're feeling tired, you should. And when you go to Europe, and you wonder at the joy of French and Italian people who begin the evening meal with drinks at 5 o'clock and meander off to the restaurant and have a couple of olives and another glass of wine and a wonderful meal that ends at 11. And then you go home and you stand and you go home and you say, this is a fantastic culture. It's not got all that much culture. French and Italian workers do 20% fewer hours a year in labor than Americans. They can take a long time, but they have a long time for dinner. And the next time you hear a comparison between the standard of living of the American worker, he or she gets, and what the Italian gets, make a little adjustment, which the newspapers in America don't do. The money they get, which is a little less than here, has to be balanced against the fact that for every 6 days you work, they work 5. They have something you miss you, free time, leisure, time to do with other people who care about it. So anyway, we couldn't handle it. So Americans did that last thing. They borrowed money. We became pioneers in a new way. We borrowed more money than any working class in the world ever borrowed before, starting in the 1970s. We even invented new ways to get the mass of people into debt. The credit card. Before the 1970s, that was something American Express, you remember that businessmen and women, and a few of them had as kind of perk their upper level executive job. The mass of people had them. You all have lots of them. In 30 years, we found a mechanism, pioneered, to get the mass of people deeply in debt, which the American people did. For 30 years, we kept the illusion of American prosperity because what was going on was debt, a mountain of debt, which made it possible. Of course, by 2007, after 30 years of this, we're done. We can't work more hours. We're not going to get more wages. And we are already carrying more debt than we can handle. So predictably, everything falls apart in 2007 as millions of people begin to realize they can't do it. And they have to stop paying somebody. They owe money, either the bank that they have the mortgage from, or the bank they have the credit card from, or the college that they borrowed to get through. 30 years ago, the number of people getting debts to go to school was relatively small. Today, it's normal. Everything is done on debt. Well, it doesn't take an advanced degree in economics, although I had that. But it doesn't take that to understand that if you're taking more and more debt on, but your wages are flat, you're going to have to hit a stone wall. That's why this crisis is serious. It's not your typical up and down. It's coming at the end of 30 years. Now the other side of the coin, very quickly. For 30 years, remember, wages are flat. Wages are flat, by the way, because America changes in 1970. First, we have a new technological innovation, the computer. Makes it unnecessary to have all kinds of people working because the machine will do that. You used to pay 100 people to keep inventory in a supermarket, measure and watch how many boxes of Rice Krispies go off the shelf. Now you know as you check out, the little code and it kicks off in the machine, and somebody in Boise, Idaho is looking at all the AMPs across America and knows exactly how many Rice Krispies have left the shelf in each store across the country. Thousands of people are gone. One person looks at the computer, and that was reference. Number two, the American corporation began in the 1970s to understand that World War II and that peculiar period after it were over. The defeated countries had come back and were now producing again. Germany and Japan leading the way. And they were good. They knew how to recover from the disaster of a lost war. They knew the United States was in charge, so they knew what they had to do was to produce what the Americans produced better or cheaper, or else you had no chance at all. So they went to work and did that. Why you drive a Toyota, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now the Americans, what are they going to do with the American corporation? They could have decided to try to change our technology. They could have done a lot of things. They didn't do that. They decided to move to where labor was cheaper. And so begins this massive exodus still going on, moving production out of the United States to another part of the world. But if you're doing that, then you need fewer workers. The computer means you need fewer workers. The moving out of the country means you need fewer workers. And at the same time, the women are coming into the labor force. Less demand for labor, more supply of labor. We teach in economics. The demand goes down, the supply goes up, the price goes nowhere. And that's what happens. So for 30 years, we have a flat wage. What is the wage again? It's what the employer gives you for working. What the wage is. Meanwhile, what does he give the employer? Because you probably noticed the employer doesn't give you a wage and say, thank you very much, have a nice day. They want something from labor. You got to work for 8 hours. Well, you need economics measure how much you produce per hour. It's called productivity. Government keeps record. So we know what happened over the last 30 years in labor productivity. How much the average worker in America produced for his or her employer. It went up every year. Why? Our workers are better educated. We have more machinery. We have better machinery. We've made technical breakthroughs, et cetera, et cetera. All the usual reasons. And now with me, let's go. Like television programs for children. If what the employer gives the worker is the same for 30 years, but what the worker provides for the employer goes up steadily for 30 years, what do you call that? Good news for the employer. Spectacular. Better news than anyone ever told these employers they would see when they were going through business school. This is a dream. For 30 years, we get more and more out of the worker as a corporation, as an employer, to sell. We don't have to give the worker any more at all. More and more output per hour, flat wage. That's why for 30 years we had a profit boom. Corporations in the 70s began noticing, and I worked with some. They began noticing they're making money hand over fist. They didn't have to raise the wages anymore. Workers were happy to keep the job with those wages. Now, what did business do? And what did the people that business hires to tell Americans what's going on? What did they do? Did they make the analysis I just did? No, 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 no. Here's what they did. Here's what they did. First, big executives of corporations being told by the accountants, we're doing spectacular. We're making money. Wow. The corporation executives knew exactly what to say. This is because, they said, we are executives. We began, well, very important in America. We began to develop the cult of the smart executive. Remember names like Lee Iacocca or Jack Welch of GE fame. Lee Iacocca was an automobile executive. They went around and said, well, because of us. The same guy who hadn't made anything for 20 years was suddenly a genius. We were all supposed to believe that the sudden explosion of productivity was because of a what? A sudden explosion of smarts among our executives. What kind of crapola was it? But when you thought about it for a minute, you realized what the real point of it was. Because if the exploding wealth of the employers had something to do with the genius of the executive, then it would make sense to pay them accordingly. So in the 1970s, we began this wonderful American, no other country has done this American inflation of the top executives' income. 2 or 3 years ago, In the middle of this crisis, Americans were horrified to discover that in the middle of everything suffering, big executives at Goldman Sachs, and General Motors, and so forth, were taken home hundreds of millions of dollars. And Americans have been angry about it ever since. Look, I'm glad that we're angry about it. I'm glad Americans are angry. They're just 30 years late. This is a 30-year process. We are now wildly unequal as a society because we put so much money in the hands of the people at the top who walked away with this wonderful historical opportunity of flat wages and rising productivity. In the 1970s, the United States was a less unequal society than most of the other industrial societies. The gap between rich and poor was narrower here than in places like France and so on. Now we are number one in equality. In 30 years, we jumped over all the others to become the country in which the gap between rich and poor is the widest. I've just given you the explanation of why that was. Okay, fast forward. What else did they do with their wealth besides pay themselves huge amounts of money? They developed a whole new industry. If you've got 100,000, 200,000 executives earning money like there's no tomorrow, they need people to manage these enormous fortunes. They're busy presiding over the company. So we have a new industry, the hedge fund. It runs around and collects these people and says, we'll manage your money for you. And they compete with one another to try to do it. And if you're a hedge fund, you're trying to compete to get this executive 200 million, that executive 80 million, wild amounts of money, you have to offer good returns. Otherwise, they'll go to others, lots of hedge funds. So the hedge funds collect all this wealth and compete with one another, and they have to take ever greater risks in order to get the client. So we become more and more risky with this concentrated wealth at the top, which is why we had so many speculations that turned out to be no good. Banks making loans they shouldn't have, people who couldn't possibly pay that because for a while it produced the illusion of good results and the money all rushed there. Typical of capitalism, when it has a profit period, it spins out into accumulation. What else happened to that wealth? American companies accelerated living abroad. To close a factory in New Jersey and open it in Shanghai is a very risky and difficult and expensive proposition. Suddenly, when corporations had all these profits, they could afford that. And so that process of leaving the United States accelerated. If these strike you as not very attractive outcomes of making some people very wealthy at the expense of everybody else, you've understood, which is why we should have that and why there should have been a debate about this change in our culture rather than we all live through it in a kind of fog of not quite knowing what was going on. Well, then it blows up. The mass of people can't work anymore, can't borrow anymore. They haven't got the money to keep this going. And the people at the top have misspeculated with that wealth that accrued in their hands. So the system collapses. 2007, 2008. In the last third of 2008, believe me, because I was involved a little bit with it, people in Washington and in New York, which are the blue cities that matter for this in the United States, all due respect, appreciate all the other cities that are not relevant. There was a feeling that it was going to collapse. I mean, the whole economic system, our credit system seized up. Nobody would lend money to anybody. Banks that had been doing business together for 50 years stopped speaking to each other because they didn't trust either of them could pay back any loan you might give them, so there was no movement. The economy tanked. And in those 4 months, those last 4 months of 2008, shortly after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, paying attention at the time, suddenly something spectacular happened. Very rare in American history. The entire government, Republicans, Democrats, Bush is still in power as president at that time. Everybody agrees what they would have to be done. And in a very short time, weeks, and in some cases, decisions were made in days to spend trillions, trillions of dollars to get this credit system going. Because if you've understood what I told you, everybody depends on credit. Every corporation, every household, every store, everything is about credit. If credit doesn't anything you like. And that was where we were those 4 months of 2008. So the government, seeing the panic that could come, terribly afraid of what all the Republican, Democrat, who cared, everybody got together and spent wild amounts of money. Where does the government get the money? No, because, well, they were right. If you didn't do it, then the discussion about how to do it would be academic in the worst sense of the word. Who cares? You had to bail everybody. You had to get the system fixed. And the only thing they could think of was to go to the banking system, the financial system of America, and basically say, okay, you are no longer in charge here. We are going to provide every bit of money anybody needs from now on. We are going to guarantee the debts of all the major banks. We are going to give the banks the money that they couldn't borrow from anybody else so they can keep functioning. In that time, the United States government did something which, like the flat wages, we could not talk about as a nation because of the Cold War leftover of what can and cannot be said in polite conversation. The United States nationalized and those banks became, and many of them still are, government supported entities. We socialized. We did what we think socialism is. That's what we socialized our well. We poured money into every major bank. We gave huge amounts of money, your money. That's what we did. We guaranteed their debts, which not only commits the money we have now, but commits your children and grandchildren to take care of it. The debt is open-ended. The largest insurance company, which had written insurance policies for every financial transaction that couldn't be made anymore, called the AIG Corporation, they announced that they couldn't make good on their insurance policy. And so the government took them over and still runs them. We poured $200 billion into that corporation alone. It's 80% owned by the United States. That is a socialized insurance company, the biggest in the world. We took over General Motors, which we still subsidize on a massive scale, and so on. Everybody was agreed. There was no significant dissent. Anyway, where did the government get this money? Nobody cared. But we should have cared. Let's think a minute. There's really only three ways for a government ever to get money. It either taxes people, one way to get it. But if you think Mr. Bush was low on popularity in the waning months of 2008, given everything that was happening, imagine the attitude towards the fellow if he had said, okay, you have to raise the money to bail everybody out, so every American family has to cough up another $18,000, roughly what it would have been. Poor Mr. Bush, he would have been lucky to make it out alive. That's why we can't finance our wars. We don't like them anyway, and we have to pay for them on top of fighting them, and the polls would be even more negative. We don't do that. So the government couldn't tax. Didn't see any way it could do that. Okay, that leaves two ways. You can print the money. Governments love to do that, because that's quick and that's cheap. Just the paper, it doesn't cost much. So there were temptations. And for those of you that pay attention, we have been printing money, lots of it. But we couldn't do all of it that way because that would make the whole world about the dollar. That's very dangerous for us because the world uses the dollar the way it uses no other currency. Over the last 30 years that the United States has been playing this game of flat wages and rising productivity, the government has never had the courage to tax anywhere near enough to pay for what the government does. The mass of people don't want to pay taxes, and the rich don't want to pay taxes. And the corporation can't afford to alienate either of those two, so it kind of plays the game of, okay, I'll do what you want. I mean, you want to pay, I'll borrow. And over the last 30 years, we borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. And when the United States government borrows, it gets increasingly desperate to find somebody to lend. We are the world's biggest debtor. Nobody's even close. We're the biggest debtor country in the world. And you might enjoy just thinking about it. You might enjoy knowing, in case you hadn't heard, who the biggest foreign creditor is, because the United States, when it borrows abroad as well as at home. The People's Republic of China is the largest lender. So let me just help you see that you're in a new world. The number one capitalist country in the world is in debt for $1.5 trillion. That's what that is, to the number one communist country in the world. I know many of you are fond of that American pastime, second only to baseball, of celebrating how wonderful we are and how terrible the communists are. Think about it. It might be worth a moment's thought what it might mean, this situation. But it means also, among all the other things, that we can't play around with the dollar because the rest of the world will be very angry at what they have, in this case the Chinese, and the number two country that the old money to is Japan, that these two countries would be very upset with us if we unilaterally devalue what they hold their wealth in, namely in dollars. So we couldn't do that. So what was left was borrowing. Borrowing means a word. There was we borrow. Besides borrowing from other countries, and we also bought that is our government borrows from America. You all know that because of many a day you felt a knock on the door where you live, an agent from the government saying, the government needs to borrow. Could you please lend us something? I'm trying humor. That doesn't that doesn't happen to you because you're not rich enough. I hate to tell you, but the government doesn't want to spend time with little people like you. Me get $18.14, not interest. So they borrow big amounts of money. Who do they borrow from? Wealthy individuals and large corporations led by banks that lend to the government. This leads you to a wonderful conclusion. Over the last 30 years, and especially the last three, the government of the United States doesn't tax corporations and rich people. That's what I'm going to finish with in a couple of minutes. It doesn't tax them. Instead, it goes to them and it says, lend me the money, which corporations and rich people can do because they didn't have to pay the taxes. The money they didn't give the government in tax is what they lend to the government. And think of it as a rich person. This is something you do when you're this. Imagine you're rich. You could be taxed by the government to cover a problem of the government. Then they come, take your money, say goodbye, and end of story. But they don't do that. They come instead and they say, give me the money, I won't tax it. Give it to me as a loan. I'll give it all back to you, and between now and when I give it back to you, I'll pay you interest too. If you're a wealthy individual or corporation, would you be against the government borrowing? Yes, because Americans are easy in these areas to fool. The politician, banker, and corporate president who gets up appropriate days to give you a speech about the importance of living within our means. Government wouldn't be running for Africa has in his own portfolio lots of them because they're a very good investment. He's taken the money he hasn't paid in taxes and lent it to the government. The way you do that is to buy what's called treasury security, an IOU of the government. That's how it's done. So the people giving you the speeches about what shouldn't happen are the ones making money off the fact that it happened. And if that sounds to you as though it might be hypocritical, then I've been clear in my presentation. That's what it is. So now we come to the crisis. The government has spent all this money. It's borrowed all this money. It's broke. Listen to Governor Walker in Wisconsin. We're broke. Governor Kasich in Ohio. We're broke. Governor Cuomo in New York. There's no money. We have to lay off 4,000 teachers, and we have to cut back on the nutrition program for pregnant women, and we have to. There's no money. Stop. What are you talking about? There's oodles of money. Money is the one thing we've generated. operated for the last 30 years in wild profusion. What we haven't done is made sure that the government, to perform its normal functions, and especially its functions in a crisis to bail the system out, can tap that money in a reasonable way. So let's turn to the topic that Americans freak out about most, taxes. Let's see whether there's money there and whether it's reasonable. Let's start with the federal government, then we'll go to state government, and then I'll be done. Federal government. The biggest source of income for the federal government is income tax. Everything else is small by. There's two kinds of income, one on corporations and one on individuals. The income of a corporation is what we would normally call its profit, net revenue. What's left over when you subtract costs of doing business from the revenue you get selling whatever is in business to produce. The United States government taxes that. It is corporate income, and they have to pay an income tax. Just like you and I have to pay an income tax on our wages and salary, whatever other income we have. Let's take a look at that. 50 years ago, the United States government got, ready, 50% more of its revenue from corporations than from individuals. In other words, corporations as a whole in America had to come up with 50% more than was taken from individuals. Corporations were the major support of the government's budget. What is the situation today? Corporations pay 1/4 of the amount that individuals. You understand the shift? That's not small, that's not little, that's not marginal. That's massive. Individual, the federal government has been taken off business steadily for 50 years and put on you. And on behalf of corporate America, thank you. Okay? Now let's take a look at the second thing. The big thing now is individual income tax. Corporations have gotten out of it. When you heard Matt earlier say GE paid 2%, Goldman Sachs, or they get refunds, that's what you're tacking into. The hearing, give the particular examples of this enormous mega trend. Now let's look at the individual income. Same story. I tell you this only because my experience as a teacher of economics, that nobody knows this. In the 1960s and 70s, you're paying tax back then, so you remember. In the 1960s and 70s, I'll take 1 year, 1970. In 1970, the top income tax bracket in the United States was 70%. Here's what that meant. If you were a single individual in 1970 in America, every dollar you earned over $100,000 a year, for rich people, obviously, every dollar over $100,000, ready? You would have to give Uncle Sam 70 cents. You got to keep 30. You think that's high? In the previous 15 years before 1970, the rate was most of those years 91%. Ready? Every dollar over 100,000 you earned as a rich income earner, you had to give the government 91 cents, and you kept nothing. Why? Because we had just been through a catastrophic depression and then World War II. And in those situations, the argument in America was we all have to pull together, and those who have the most have to contribute the most. And I want to remind you, this 91% before 1970 and 70% in the 1970s was endorsed by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, Republican Congresses and Democrats. Nobody said it was a universally supported rule in the United States. I'm not talking about Russia or China or Cuba or anything, but we took it from the rich people as we did. What is the rate, the top rate, the income tax in the United States today? 35%. Okay? That's an income tax drop, ready, for the rich, from 91% to 60 to 35% now. That is a tax cut. You have never seen anything like that. Nothing like that happened for the vast mass of the American people, not even close. So what do we have? We have a massive shift of burden of taxation at the federal level from corporations to individuals and from the richest, all of you. So much funds who got that fund dumped on us as a kind of economic tsunami, bailed out by the government with our money. Now we are going to be told we have to take more government services, watch our neighbors and friends who work for the government as teachers and social workers, firefighters, police officers, they all lose their jobs. You've got to be kidding. In fact, as an outsider looking at this, it strikes me that if I were an advisor to the Republican Party, I'd tell them, be very careful here. You are pushing too far. You're going to get a backlash that you're going to be real sorry as people's conditions keep deteriorating. It's all of these programs make, for sure. Where's that anger going to go? Over the last weekend in the Wall Street Journal, last week, Wall Street Journal has a weekend edition covered Saturday and Sunday. So it would have been 26, 27 of March. There's a wonderful story on the inside that the Republican Party in Ohio is beginning to have second thoughts because their polls show voters are angry at them because they see this now. They're beginning to get a sense that in a time of unemployment, laying off public employees would make the unemployment impact worse. And during a time of unemployment and people without homes, we need more government service help, but you're reducing it. That then doesn't sound so good. And what's supposed to happen? Wonderful, good things, but they're not happening to me. It's very dangerous for them. Not that I worry on that much, but it is a sign that something, and the Wall Street Journal wanted to make a story, wanted us all to see that those Republicans get worried. That's, I suspect, that the Wall Street Journal is getting worried. And I think that that's a sign, too, of the very same things that we're all saying. Of course, the money. We don't have a problem with taxation. We have a problem with tax. And who isn't? We are at the end of a 30-year period where the gap between rich and poor has become unbelievable. In the hands of the rich is concentrated an enormous resource that could and used to be made available to solve problems in this country. We have a national economic crisis. What better reason, what better historical precedent than now to go to where the wealth is so that it can help get us through? We're not doing it. And it is not happening on a scale that is so overwhelming that the really interesting question, which all my friends from Europe need to email, is what is something happening in your country? What's the matter with you? What is America? One example, because it offends me so deeply. There's a debate going on for weeks. Many of you have maybe watched it or gotten bored by it. It's Republican officials in Washington talking about they have to cut the budget by $66 billion. That's what the House Republicans are now control the House. The House favor of $66 billion cut. The Democrats, no, the Democrats, the Senate. The Senate only wants 33, 66 versus 30. Right. The deficit is the gap between what the government is spending, $3.5 trillion, and what it raises in taxes, about $2. That's a $1.5 trillion debt. That's what's being borrowed from wealthy people here and from the people of China, putting this country further and further in debt. If you're dealing with a deficit of 1.5 trillion and your two major parties are debating 66 versus 33, that's like having a fight with the person trying to mug you, in which the issue is how many of the pennies in your shoe he will get. That's irrelevant. What the Democrats and Republicans are doing, they're counting on you all to think that 33 billion sounds like a lot. 66 billion, that sort of sounds like a lot. And we're fighting and we're arguing. What is important is both parties are perfectly happy to run a $1.5 trillion deficit. They both agree on that. There's no dispute whatsoever, no debate about it, no discussion of who's going to get all of the interest payment on that money. You're all going to pay for that to pay the interest of people. You don't own those bonds. You're just paying. But the rich don't get taxed. They buy the bonds. What they do with that money, they don't pay. By the way, all my rich friends that I do from consulting corporations and so on, they all explain that. This American economy is too shaky, they say. I'm not going to invest in the United States economy. That's not a good investment. I'm going to park my money in Treasury security. I'm going to take the money, I don't pay a tax, and lend it to the government. That's what they're doing. And that's not a productive use of this. That's not a build our economy. That's for the government to use to keep things from collapsing further. So what you're watching in Washington is a game, a theater of the absurd, in which the two contenders aren't contending at all. Last, and if I leave you with this, you get depressed, then again, I might lead you there, but I don't. You'll see. For 30 years, American corporations moved production out. In the last 5 or 10 years, something new has happened, and that is really serious for us going forward. American corporations continue to move production abroad, but the new thing, that's where they see their future markets growing. That's new. It means that American corporations have not only produce output, but that the growth, the future, where they should spend their money in marketing, where they should spend their money for advertising, where they should plan on their growth outside the United States. What does that do to the United States? It leaves us with a set of corporations for whom the rest of us are decreasingly relevant and important. They're more interested in making sure that laws get passed in Europe or Asia or Africa or Latin America than those laws get passed. If the roads deteriorate here, it's less urgent than making sure there are good roads elsewhere so their trucks can travel. Their interest in this society is shrinking. And the American holiday of 150 years of rising wages, our empire, economic as well as political, has never, in my lifetime, seen as shaky in the future as grim as it does now. The people in charge are making the money. They'll make the money abroad as well as they'll make it here. American icons like Pepsi Cola already make more than half their profits outside the United States. They're an American corporation, but they know what they depend on, and they depend more on the rest of society, and their politics, and their ideology, and their planning come from. They're doing what they do. They're making a lot of money in China and everything, and they're paying the dividends. People rich enough to participate in the corporation, but it's leaving the mass of the American people more and more out of the loop. That has more to say about the future of this country than else. Only stop. There isn't a change. Matt Renner's comment on the tipping point of change. That's not true. I hope it is, but if it isn't, then we're not going to see a major change. We're going to see more going down this road that has now been in effect for 30 years and hasn't even been derailed by a fantastic crisis that the whole world shook for a long time around. But I don't want to leave you with the thought that people aren't doing something. That's when we get back. Whether it's the story about Portugal I told you or the thing in Wisconsin. But the story I'm going to end with is about something that happened a while back, but that Americans don't know. And it's about America. One state in the United States out of 50 made a decision early on in the crisis, early in 2009, not to do what uh, California is doing, its neighboring state, not to do what Cuomo is doing here, not to do what Walker and Kasich and the others. It's the state of Oregon, for those of you who don't know. In 2009, here's what happened. The legislature began considering a bill. The bill went like this. We in Oregon are not going to do what our sister state, California to the south, Washington to the north, what they're doing. We are not going to cut public services. We're not going to lay off any public workers. They face the same problem every state. With the prices of unemployment, prices of home foreclosures, the revenues coming to states collapse. Unemployed people don't pay income tax because they don't have an income. And people who are in a crisis cut back on expenditures because they're scared, and so they pay less sales tax, and that's what states depend on. So every state is in trouble. Every state is having less money. They could, of course, go to the corporation rich. They don't. But Oregon is the exception. And I tell the story because it certainly must be true that if this could happen in Oregon, sure could happen lots of other places. It's summertime 2009. The legislature has a bill which says we're not going to cut services, we're not going to lay off all. How are we going to deal with the cutback of our revenue? We're going to tax corporations and we're going to tax the rich. I kid you not. And they do that. They want to tax everybody who earns over 250. Any family that earns over $250,000 a year has to pay a big increase, and any family that earns over $500,000 a year has to pay a lot big increase. It passes the first house of the legislature. People are amazed. It passes the second house of the legislature. People are more amazed. The bill is sent to the governor, who signs it. In other states, that's the end of the story, but not in the West. In the West, they take seriously these ideas, wicked lip service, practice, and all that. So in Oregon, like in other states, here's the law. If a group of people, it doesn't have to be very large, goes around and collects signatures, they can force any bill that has passed the legislature and been signed by the governor to be put up for a vote by the people as a whole. And the people decide. In other words, if the people vote against that bill, their will overwhelms the governor and the legislature. The bill is void, and they can't even allow to bring it up again for a year. In other words, the people overrule the governor and the legislature. Okay, so imagine after the governor signed it, the Republicans and the business community went nuts, predictably, and they gathered the signatures very quickly. They were able to do that. And that required then a date set. I believe the date was 10th of January 2010. On that day, after months of campaigning by the two sides, 1.2 million people, citizens of Oregon, went to the polls. No one. They voted decisively in favor of the law. So Oregon is not doing what the rest of the United States is doing. And if you don't know that, then that's a lesson in how the media in this country works. You don't know. Even though nothing could be more relevant. For all of you that are considering, for example, what the governor of the state of New York is now doing, nothing could be more relevant than the question, why aren't we doing, or at least debating doing, what Oregon did? Oregon is in SFA. And so it might be reasonable to take it as a model or as an image of what we could do. Even if there weren't an Oregon, we should discuss it, but we actually have a place. When Americans get mobilized and clear that it's kind of gone too far and they want to make a basic change, they have shown themselves able to do that. It's scary. We have a long tradition of time when thinking like this and talking like this got labeled with words I won't repeat because you all know them anyway. But what may surprise a lot of you is that those times are over, for better or for worse. The best example is me, because I go all around the country talking like this. And instead of people looking at me funny and worried that they're in the same room, keep inviting me. And I'm having a wonderful time. Thank you very much for your attention. And now, as Matt explained, if you have any comments, questions, expressions of outrage, there are mics. And so if you do it that way at the mic, or you bring the mic around, and everybody can hear the question or the comments or the whatever.
Hi, Professor Bowles. I have a couple of questions and comments. First is that I don't know if you know this, but at the time that productivity and wages uncoupled, so did the lowering of the rank of unionized workers. And in fact, today, the level of people in private sector unions is lower than it was for the Wagner Act in 1935. It is lower, and I believe that part of the success in creating the structural inequality has been an attack on labor unions and the attack on labor, and it should be mentioned. I'm sure you agree, but I also have been following this group called the Robin Hood X group. I don't know if you know them, but they're talking about if you go to their website robinhoodtax.org, there's like a little video of a baker being asked, why don't you go and pay a financial transactions tax? And they say, oh, how much would that be? And it goes down to basically like, oh, less than 1%. And how many would that make? It would be like hundreds of billions of dollars. Anyway, I think that what I can't believe that nobody has raised this issue of a financial transaction tax, because I frankly think that it's the rich that got us into this. And that's where, if there's going to be revenue, it should be from there. So I'd like your
The numbers, for those of you that are in the private sector of the United States, according to the United States Department of Labor,